the discussion forward and discuss our next topic for the evening today, careers in finance. Let me please invite Mr. Mandar Bharate. Mandar is a CFA charter holder and a volunteer with CFA Society India. As a part of his day job, he focuses on valuation and portfolio discussions at Falcon Edge Capital. Over to you, Mandar.
Thank you, Megha. Good evening. Good evening, afternoon, and morning, ladies and gentlemen. I am Mandar Bharate. It's wonderful to have participants from different countries on this conference. Welcome to everyone. As CFA Society India, it is a pleasure to have Devie Mohan at India FinTech Conference 2020. Devie is a renowned FinTech industry advisor with years of experience in the industry, top 10 influencers in FinTech, and a global thought leader based in London. She's a co-founder and CEO of Ondemand, a global FinTech research company. A contributor to the ING Group Think Forward initiative, and she sits on the board of editorial board of Journal of Digital Banking. Prior to this, she has worked in strategy, marketing, and analysis roles in firms like Goldman Sachs, Thomson Reuters, IBM, USAID, and Suntech. In 2019, she was included in the Financial Times list of 100 most influential BAME leaders in technology. And she won the Women in Finance Award in the UK. She has authored a book named The Financial Services Guide to FinTech. The book was published recently, and it goes without saying that it is a great read to understand the global FinTech landscape. Welcome to the conference, Devie. And there is still a lot more to complete the introduction of Devie. Hope I have not missed out on many elements in the introduction.
Hi, sorry about that. Thank you, Mandar, for the wonderful introduction. It sounds like I do a lot based on the introduction. It's quite interesting to see how the journey has happened in terms of my own career and career of others in the FinTech world. I've been watching the space since 2010, and it's been so different in terms of what's happening now and what was happening in 2010. And as I'm sure all of you are aware, in 2010, the conversations were so rudimentary in terms of what is FinTech and why should we care about FinTech. And now we are talking about really big things. And I love Swapnendu's presentation from that point of view. I mean, what Singapore has done from a regulatory angle, what the UK has done in terms of banking and regulatory angles, it's really fascinating. So I'm hoping today that I can speak a little bit about what FinTech means in terms of the culture, the career opportunities, the skills we need going forward, and also what has helped in the last few years in terms of skill development. So again, we'll take questions at the end. So I'm hoping to give you an introduction, and then we can go into details at a later time.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that's a wonderful pretext. And just to set the context for the participants, the way we envision this discussion is to touch upon the industry and dynamics, and then connect them to the key element, which is careers in FinTech. It's a sort of a top-down approach. And given the nature of the topic, we wanted the discussion to be more interactive, enabling more number of audience questions. So we will try to wrap up the discussion relatively quickly, as you mentioned, and then open the floor for questions. A request to audiences, please feel free to ask the questions, and we'll try to take as many questions within the given time frame. One of the key filters that we'll be applying is to avoid questions on very specific situations. This will help the audience as a whole. So with that, Devie, maybe we can, we can have your perspectives on the current state trends of the industry globally and in India.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mandar. I'll try my best. So I'm going to share my presentation now. I hope everyone can see that. Brilliant. So one of the things that we need to kind of look at beyond the technology is why FinTech has been so successful in terms of capturing the industry, the valuations that we see for startups, and also in terms of the number of people who want to work in that space. One of the major reasons for that is in 2010, or 2008 to 2010, when the world was seeing one of the worst economic crises that we have ever seen, we were trying to find new ways, or Silicon Valley entrepreneurs and the Silicon Roundabout entrepreneurs here in the UK, we were trying to find new ways of doing disintermediation, doing business in the financial services space. What it meant was there was a focus on customer experience and less on the vast amount of content available to us. A great example of that is Google. So if you look at what Google did, what they did was successfully disrupt the search engine industry in a way. If you look at Yahoo from the 90s, and without revealing my age, I can tell you that I used Yahoo quite a lot before Google came into the picture. And if you used Yahoo in the 1990s, you had all of that information available on the front page of the, as soon as you went to the search engine. And everything from the weather to the news to the stock prices, it is all available on the front page. Wonderful concept, a lot of content available in one place. But what happened when disruption came about with Google was that there was an element of simplicity. You don't need to have all of the content in one page simply because it takes you 0.02 seconds to go and search and find the information you're looking for. So the speed of the algorithm, the nature of the algorithm helps you find what you're looking for without having all of the content in one place. So this kind of transformation towards the simplicity and customer experience was a huge driver in what we see as FinTech today. The other major change we saw back then was with on-demand services. For example, Uber. And I'll give you the example of London because I've seen that happening here quite a lot. A lot of the people who called Uber in the early days were not people who were actually taking black taxis or the expensive cabs to go from place to place. These were people who have never taken a cab before, and they were walking from meeting to meeting, or they were taking a bus or public transport to go from place to place. So the real transformation with Uber didn't happen from the black cab, the traditional industry, transformed into the digital industry alone. Of course, that happened, but the biggest change that they brought about was actually including in completely new market segments that never used the service before. So it's not just, as Swapnendra mentioned earlier, it's not just a traditional industry transforming digitally, it's actually including a lot more groups. And it could be gender-based groups, age-based groups, or small businesses. All of these groups who were never being able to take a cab or any kind of traditional service for whatever reasons, mainly price, they were now taking Uber. So that was another major trend that led to what we call FinTech today. The other trend that we should be aware of is around personalization. And Spotify is a lovely example of this. So if you know what the strategy Spotify adopted in the early days was, they would have, of course, thousands of music available, just like a satellite radio, but on demand, available on your phone, but also they would create lists for you to listen to. So one of the reasons for Spotify's huge success was not just the availability of these thousands of songs, but actually the ability for them to recommend songs for you that you may never have heard before. And they would personalize it based on what you were listening to, your interests, and all the things that you were doing on the app. And this personalization actually led to another big revolution leading to the fintech industry. And finally, as we all know, it's social media is absolutely fundamental to what we see in terms of what fintechs are doing. So these elements of simplicity, the customer experience, the focus on that, the ability to use social media as a driver, whether it's data coming into the fintech, or whether it's sharing information through social media, or even just content. All of that is very much a feature of fintech. Now, when we understand this, we kind of understand what fintechs are looking for in terms of skills, in terms of resources, and in terms of the future paths. What does a bank of the future look like? And this is something that I always find challenging in my conversations with banks. If you look at banks today, especially in Europe, I don't know about India so much. I think India is far better, in my opinion. But if you have conversations with banks in Europe, you find that a lot of the conversation of digitalization revolve around branches and making them, either removing branches, of course, or making them look sleeker. Putting iPads instead of customer service agents, using the app, of course, while in a branch or at home, removing call centers to use chatbots, to use wearables like Apple Watch to access your bank account. So a lot of the conversation with banks today, even after 10 years of fintech, revolve around changing or transforming the traditional channels they always had into something digital. But in my opinion, I think it's a mistake to do that because we are fundamentally changing the way banking transactions happen. We may not even need iPads or apps or wearables in the future. It could be something completely integrated with your voice control devices, for example. If you have Amazon Echo in your home, you can transfer money to your friends pretty quickly just by saying, give $10 to my friend in that with this ID. Or it could be something that's very much part of your day-to-day behavior as part of other apps that you may use. It could be part of social media that you use. So we need to kind of think beyond simple digital transformation of existing things into sleeker or better looking things, but we need to think of digitalization in a much more integrated way and how our lives will change. And I think Asia is far better at doing this than Europe in that it's already integrated into WhatsApp, to mobile wallets, to other social media that we use. Now, with that in mind, I'm taking a very simple example that's probably very popular and you might have seen already is how do we make disintermediation happen? Traditionally, if you look at the website of a high street bank, you would find that all of the information is built around products. Now, by products, it could be anything from loans, from payday loans all the way to mortgages and big amounts, investing, your advisory around investing, insurance, which is mainly property, life. Life in India is huge. In the UK, it's property. And nowadays, a little bit of device phone insurance and travel insurance and so on. Then you also have your basic current accounts, your savings accounts, and sometimes you have interesting products like student loans, not always, etc. So this is the way traditionally banking has been segmented. Now, what's happening with fintech is, of course, each of these elements are getting digitalized and transformed, and a lot of them are getting disintermediated by kicking out the intermediary as a bank. So TransferWise is a great example of that, in that you have actually removed the intermediary from the process of transferring money from country to country. All of that has happened in the last 10 years in terms of taking every single element of a traditional banking product and disintermediating them to build a completely new product based on the criteria I talked about, which is simplicity, customer experience, and personalization. That's already happened. Now, what is exciting for me is that the next phase of FinTech, I think we are kind of seeing the third phase of FinTech now. I'll talk about the second phase later. But the third phase of FinTech starting 2020, with all of the disruption we've seen, is that it's not just individual products that are being disintermediated today. Some of these FinTechs that I have on this map from 2014, they are now unicorns, and they're now acquiring other unicorns as well. So it's a very interesting change that we will see, in that they are getting bigger and they are bringing umbrella products into them, and they are also changing the way products are designed or segregated from the past. So as I mentioned, the biggest change from shifting from the traditional world to the FinTech world is around 5 things. One, of course, is cheaper. Normally, FinTech products, everything from advisory to savings accounts to, current accounts, not savings, to lending products are generally cheaper than a traditional product. Innovation, of course, we misuse the word sometimes. We talk about innovation a lot, that it's kind of lost meaning, but the fact that you put the customer first and you're continuously experimenting is very much part of the FinTech ethos. You have better experience, the focus on customer experience and the front end, and making sure the back end, the technology supports this experience on the front. And finally, taking outside help. To me, that is the biggest cultural shift that has come about with FinTech, in that FinTechs have brought about the concept of collaboration, not just collaboration with other tech companies, but with banks, with regulators, with supervisors, and with the governments. And by building a FinTech ecosystem that includes so many different parties, we are able to innovate much more. And this is the biggest change that we have seen coming from pre-2010 or 2008 to now. And I think this has fundamentally changed the way the industry works. The funding and within that ecosystem, of course, has grown so much in the last few years. And if you look at this from 2019, you find that, of course, I mean, the UK has been traditionally one of the largest markets for FinTech and FinTech adoption specifically. But now, if you look at it, it's India, China, Russia, and some countries in Africa actually leading the way in terms of FinTech adoption. Now, we need to differentiate between FinTech adoption and investment levels. So investment levels in India and Russia and South Africa are actually not as high as the adoption numbers that we see. It's still highest in the US and in the UK. And then third is Singapore, interestingly. But in terms of adoption, India and China are definitely leading the way. And it is a fantastic place to start, because the willingness to adopt, the willingness of regulations and frameworks to be created to support FinTech has been extremely good in India and also with China. There's been a big push towards digital, and especially around payments. And this is a great place to start. But I think what will be more exciting is when we see investment levels as the same as what we see in UK and Europe today. And we see much more collaboration and FinTech bridges being developed between countries as well. Now, I spoke about investment as one of the major challenges in the FinTech ecosystem in India. And if you look at that, around the world, there was a drop in FinTech funding, of course, in 2020. But before that, in 2019, we saw a small dip in the early months of 2019, which caught up in Q4 2019. Now, if we look at India and China specifically, you find that India has actually crossed in the last quarter of 2019 in terms of investments against China. So it's a fantastic new development in terms of establishing India and China are very close competitors in the FinTech ecosystem. Of course, there was one big deal that happened which contributed to that skewing with 197. But we have also seen in the early parts of 2020 that this is continuing. So India is very much a focus. in terms of the FinTech ecosystem around the world. Most of the conversations I have with banks and regulators and in the UK revolve around what's India doing. In fact, I'm part of a committee for Brexit relationships with India. So they have a separate committee set up with the government in terms of building relationships with India and, after UK goes through Brexit. So all of these are kind of pointing towards India being a fascinating market, along with some other parts of the world. Now, I'm sure this is something everyone is familiar with, but just as an overview, the Indian market, this is again very much an Indian way of segregating FinTech. We don't do that here in the UK, but the Indian way of segmenting the FinTech market has been around payments, lending, investment and robo-advisory, and personal finance. Now, the reason I say it's very much an Indian way of segmenting it is because in Europe, you wouldn't see, for example, payments wallets as a segment. We don't have a lot of payment wallets or virtual wallets companies here in the UK. The same thing with loan marketplaces, for example. We have some invoice financing marketplaces, but not as many loan marketplaces as you have, and some of the more popular ones. Personal finance, not a huge segment in Europe. There is some, the InsurTech was a growing market till about 2019 for various reasons. I'm happy to go into detail if you want, but InsurTech isn't growing as fast as we had hoped in 2019. Robo-advisory is another segment which has kind of been stable in Europe, growing in the US, but not as much as Asia again. The fastest growing segment in Europe today, especially in the UK, is B2B. So B2B FinTech, especially around RegTech, around risk management, cash management solutions, all of that is fast growing here in the UK. So slightly different in terms of priorities and focus for ecosystems in India and the UK. Again, happy to delve into more details in the questions later. But I want to quickly touch upon challenger banking because it's one of my favorite topics and something that I think the UK has done extremely well. And it's a fantastic case study of how well to build a FinTech ecosystem. And the reason, all of that started, I think, in 2012, when the FCA, the regulatory authority in the UK, decided to launch a new license for challenger banks to encourage competition with traditional banks. It was a way of coming out of the economic crisis and pushing the traditional banks to do more and to kind of challenge themselves. And they thought that someone who would innovate, focus on innovation, would be a good idea to be in that market. And we have about 250, actually 270 challenger banks in the world today, including a new challenger bank launched in Australia yesterday. So it's kind of increasing in numbers every single day, and it's a fast-growing market. UK, still the largest market, with 85 challenger banks who have got a license here in the UK. And we also have a few from India, which I'm familiar with. Now, if we look at challenger banks, they all started off with the message that they want to compete with traditional banks. So they all started targeting the EC segments, customer segments, which were students or refugees coming in into Europe, or people who were not able to take bank accounts for whatever reason. But they also went after digitally savvy customers of traditional banks. So very much a B2C focus in the early days. But now, when we look at the third phase of FinTech, and 2019 and 2020, we find that the things that are succeeding now are either B2B challenger banks, or banks that have built marketplaces that involve other fintechs or other banks to be part of that ecosystem, or those who are focusing on SMEs and small corporates. So there is very much a push towards generalist and corporate customers now with challenger banks, which is a major shift from 2012, which was all about B2C and capturing customers. But we need to understand that customer acquisition is a very expensive business. So it's not easy to acquire customers anymore. It's getting more and more expensive as we go along, because we would have got a lot of the customers digitally on one of the apps already. So now they're going after the corporates and the SMEs. The other major shift that has happened in 2020 is with big techs coming in. And again, my research team has looked at what big techs have been doing in the last few months. And we find that almost all of the big techs, from Apple to Google to Amazon and Facebook, have had aspirations in financial services in the last 6 months. Google announced a partnership with 8 financial institutions in the US, mainly smaller community bank or medium-sized community banks, but they're building a digital banking platform for customer acquisition for all of them. So Google will do the customer acquisition, and the banks will take care of all of the regulatory and technology needs. So it's a very interesting model that's being built in terms of customer acquisition. And also you find people like Amazon and Apple launching products like Apple Card or loan products from Amazon. I will also quickly talk about RegTech, because it's, again, one of my favorite topics, and it's the fastest growing segment in the UK, especially with London as a hub. And the simple reason is this picture, which kind of tells you how many regulations that we are dealing with globally, and how many of those are actually converging with each other and diverging with each other in terms of global and regional complexities. So for a large financial institution, this is a huge burden to look at. And you also have the big problem that the type of regulations are changing as well around the world. There's a whole lot of new regulations that have come about with privacy, data privacy as the fundamental drive for change. You have a lot of cybersecurity laws that have come in, and you have a lot of laws that have come in around data consent and data sharing, especially in Canada, where consent has been quite a big focus for regulatory changes. So with all of those new types of regulations coming in, we are dealing with regulatory complexity in a way that we have probably never seen in the past. And another interesting thing, I think probably not a good idea to speak this in front of someone from MAS, but MAS has done a fantastic job of popularizing the term SupTech, which is supervisory tech, where regulators are working directly with startups themselves. So it's not just banks and startups working together anymore. It's through SupTech you find supervisors, especially in Asia quite a lot, in the Middle East and in Singapore and Malaysia. They're working increasingly with FinTech startups directly. And that's a segment we call SupTech. It's a fairly new term. Now, what skills do we need to find a job and survive in this market, really? I mean, like I said, we have seen around 3 phases of FinTech so far. The first phase of FinTech, which was from 2010 to 2016, the early days of FinTech, was about competition with the traditional banks, launching new products and innovating and focus on the customer. But from 2016 to 2019, we saw the second phase of FinTech, which is all about partnerships and collaboration and an increased desire of startups to work with banks directly. And now, going into 2020, I think I'm predicting here, again, who knows what will happen, but there will be a very much focus on big techs partnering with fintechs and banks to do the customer acquisition and the customer management side really well. And fintechs focusing very much on the B2B or the back-end technologies that banks need to transform and other companies need to transform. That's what I think will happen in the next phase post-COVID. But if you look at any of these changes that's happening, there is a focus on collaboration, the ability to be in a tech company or in a bank and looking at the other side and learning from them, and the ability to communicate in a way that appeals to the generation of social media. What you wear matters a lot in the fintech world purely because of that. I mean, if you're a traditional person or if you appear to be traditional, it's probably, unfortunately, not a good way to try and enter the fintech space. Tech, you don't need to be a programmer to handle fintech or work in fintech. You need digital skills from the point of view of being able to use tools to work effectively. For example, you use Slack to work as a team. You use Zoom. I mean, everyone uses Zoom now, and Skype in terms of calls, but also the ability to understand the use of technology and how technology can find solutions to problems in the market. So an overview and understanding of how tech works is definitely helpful, even if you're not a programmer. And the most important thing, of course, is problem solving through finding solutions as a team, through research, through numeracy, which is probably a great strength for this group here today. And all of these skills are needed to find your career in fintech. If you want to start your own fintech, funnily enough, there's no specific background and no specific age requirement to be an entrepreneur. And one of the problems I had when I was pretty young was everyone telling me, oh, you need to have a certain background if you want to start your own company. You need to have work in a bank and understand how banks work, or you need to be in consulting and know strategy well. But in reality, you find founders coming from anywhere, in any segment, and some with no experience at all. And also you find people of different age groups starting up. The average age in the UK for starting a new fintech is 38. So it's not a young group that's necessarily launching fintechs. 38 is the average age of a founder here. In India, it's much younger. It's around 32. But yes, so again, age is probably not a factor. I'll briefly explain how I ended up in fintech, because it's, again, kind of tells you that there's no one path. I studied both tech and finance. I was very lucky for fintech to happen because it kind of fit in very well with what I studied. I did computer engineering in the 90s, and which was a new phenomenon back then. So I was one of the first few people to study computer engineering in India at the time. And then I did an internship with IBM, which was very much around programming and the hardcore technical stuff. But then I decided that I want to work on the business side and not in programming, which led me to do my MBA in finance and strategy. And then I interned with an investment bank, which is Goldman Sachs in London at the time, which got me into equities and sales, equity sales desk around technology again. The interesting thing after that is I never went into either finance or technology. I worked in every sector I wanted to work in. I worked in USAID, which is a funding agency, part of the US government. I spent a lot of time doing fund management for countries in Africa, in Asia, which was quite interesting. I worked in Ericsson, looking after managed services. I worked in Thomson Reuters, looking after again, a lot of the APIs and data tools that come in. I worked in Suntech as head of marketing. So there were so many different things that I did in my career, in my life, which I think lead very much into fintech the way it is today, because it doesn't look for a specific background. It looks for exposure to different things, really. And now I feel like I do 10 jobs. I spend a lot of time, of course, with Burnmark, my startup that focuses on research in the fintech ecosystem. I'm part of the ING Think Forward initiative. We work on problem solving around consumer decision making, around finance. Again, a kind of non-profit approach to how to get consumers to make better decisions. I spend a lot of time advising banks and startups on boards, etc. I've written a book, as Mandar mentioned earlier. I'm writing my next one, which will be out soon. And I also spend a lot of time and on social media, trying to influence the way the market works. So I feel like I have 10 different jobs, and I probably do a lot more as well. But it's a very unconventional path that has led me here, and I'm happy to talk more about it to anyone aspiring to find a path that may work well for them. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Devie. Then that's a fascinating overview. You covered the drivers which are behind the industry, the disruption which is happening. You mentioned about the third phase of fintech and then the comparison and contrast of how the industry is basically growing and developing in different countries vis-a-vis India. Uh, on that note, we have one question here in terms of the nature of roles. And again, this is from the context of India, given your insights about how ecosystem is growing in India and how it may grow in future. What are the nature of roles that you are seeing that will evolve? At the same time, there is another dimension to this in terms of nature of organizations, right? So there are obviously startups, then there is policy-related work, consulting firms. But if you can, give some, additional details around these two dimensions, it will be great.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing to remember is, again, which side of the fintech ecosystem you want to work in. So of course, you have the startups, then you have the banks, and then you have the regulator, and finally you have the investor. And also now we see a lot of academia being involved as well. So all of this offer you completely different roles, I believe. And in a startup, typically, of course, you can found your own startup. You can be an entrepreneur, or a lot of the roles are around everything from the corporate, the finance, the legal, the risk side, all the way to the consumer-facing sides, which could be business development, marketing, and then the technology angle. In the bank, again, I think a fintech knowledge is absolutely essential for any role in banking today, especially roles that are facing the digital transformation side. So anything to do with the products, payments, lending, the traditional products, anything to do with customer management, and anything to do with transformation projects and regulatory transformation projects would need a background or interest in fintech and the ability to learn very quickly. And finally, on the regulatory side, most regulators tend to set up committees and groups, and the RBI has set up a new department to work specifically on the blockchain. And all of this will be places where you can find roles if you're interested in fintech. But again, I don't think there will be a huge change in the hiring patterns going into 2020. The major difference is now it will be virtual teams we are looking at, and you could probably be in any part of India applying to any startup anywhere in India, which is a fantastic thing, I believe. And that will give more opportunities to find roles, the right role in the market.
Sure. And, I'm seeing a lot of questions around a similar pattern to some extent you've addressed in your discussion, that how does a finance candidate or a person with a finance background without any tech background, gets into a fintech role. As I mentioned, you have considered, you have touched upon that aspect, but given how situation is prevailing in India and how it may evolve, from a perspective of 5 to 10 years, if you can break it down, where to start, which are the areas to focus, that would be very helpful for the audience.
Okay, I think if you want to talk about practically getting into tech from a finance background, as I said before, you don't need a tech background, a programming background to be in tech. What you need, though, is an understanding of what tech solutions exist. Now, one of the best ways to do that is by taking business-focused technology courses around things like AI, blockchain, or even full stack programming. There are a lot of online courses now available that focus on the business side of technology. So you don't necessarily learn how to code or build machine learning algorithms, but you can actually understand the capabilities of these technologies. One of the courses I teach is the Harvard University FinTech certification course, which is a 6-week course. I'm not promoting it, but it's a fantastic course to get an overview of what FinTech does. And there are similar courses in other universities as well. You can also look at learning the basics of, for example, decentralized ledger, blockchain management, or databases, and how they work in a decentralized way. So you have the basic ground level technology around data and data storing and databases and managing that. Then you have the next layer, which is using that data to build things, using programming languages. And finally, you have the customer-facing front end. So there are different layers of technology we're talking about. So depending on your interest, you can actually learn in depth about any of these three. To give you an example, if you have a finance background and you're interested in risk or risk management, then a lot of the innovation today happening is around managing risk with AI. And you would want to learn how data works, the bottom layer and the second layer on top, which is using that data to understand where, for example, there's a risk around fraud or risk around market manipulation if you're a regulator. So all of this can be monitored with the help of AI and algorithms. So you would then need to learn about data and the second layer. If your interest is in the front end, usually I find people with a finance background, CFA background, not looking deeper into the front end and the customer experience, but that could be an angle that you are good at. And you can combine that with your finance knowledge in terms of creating new risk and regulatory products.
So that's wonderful. A lot of new elements and dimensions you mentioned. Now, if you look at a group of audience, maybe broadly we can categorize in two groups. One group would be, recently the group has completed the studies, not too much of an experience, whereas one group which has substantial experience, and given given the nature of the background, we are talking about the finance experience primarily. So are there two different kind of strategies for these two groups, and how can they plan any kind of a role move into fintech, whether it's a different gamut of roles that you mentioned? So what could be strategies around this?
Yeah, I think it depends on personality more than experience is my view on this. You could be a fresher or you could have 10 or 15 years of experience, but the way to find a fintech job is by hustling. And by hustling, I mean reaching out, figuring out what you want to do, training yourself in that field, and then reaching out to startups who work in that field. It's quite simple. And it doesn't matter if you have experience or you have a lot of experience. Now, the only advantage people with a lot of experience have is that you probably have a network already. Now, having a network is probably a very, very useful thing in finding the job that you want. Like I said, looking at LinkedIn or looking at newspapers and applying for jobs, that era is gone. In fintech, it doesn't happen that way at all. It's about reaching out to startups and knowing the right people. So networking is a huge skill. And I think people who have worked in the industry for a long period have an advantage with that, in that they can reach out to banks asking for jobs, or they can reach out to people they've worked with. On the other hand, freshers have a huge advantage of actually not being too traditional in their thinking, so they can easily mold themselves into the culture of fintech and fit in very well. So some startups do prefer people who can be trained very easily, and they would go for freshers. But in either case, it's all about people who are willing to learn and adapt and not be too traditional in their thinking, who can bring in new ideas and innovate fast. So it would really not matter if you're willing to make that cultural shift. Yeah.
Very interesting perspectives. Now, one question that has come is regarding, and again connected to the freshers group that we discussed. CFA Institute, is highly focused on fintech, and the curriculum is, evolving every year. More and more fintech machine learning elements are getting captured. So what would you expect from programs such as, CFA Institute and in general, technology institutes or MBA colleges for that matter? What should they focus in their curriculums, maybe broadly, so that, the supply demand gap that may emerge, that can be bridged effectively, as well as the candidates are also more prepared.
Yeah, absolutely. I think in the third phase of fintech, like I said, I think academia will have a huge role to play, mainly because we have a skills gap. As you rightly identified, I mean, we have more demand than available resources today in fintech. There's a lot of opportunity for learning and training. Now, unfortunately, in India, most engineering colleges or accountancy courses don't teach you to be in fintech yet. There's no course specifically designed for fintech, which is a completely new industry in a way. But so what you can do, and especially with people like the CFA Institute who are developing programs around it, I think there's a huge opportunity to do a couple of things, which is one, build entrepreneurial spirit in people who are interested in working for startups. So it's not something that's easily encouraged in the curriculum in India, unfortunately, and I'm saying that because I grew up in India. Maybe things have changed, but you're not encouraged to be entrepreneurs or think differently or come up with completely different ideas and disruptive thoughts. It's not really looked upon as a good thing in India as much. I think that shift can happen with sufficient training, and that's something I kind of look up to institutes like that to encourage in terms of entrepreneurial thinking and entrepreneurial spirit. The other thing that can be introduced is if you have a group of people who have a background in accounting or finance or risk, you can actually teach them elements of technology in a way that's not too complicated or not too technical, and to help them understand the basics of these technology so they can hire people themselves when they go into an organization to do those technological solutions for them. So anything to do with data, AI, machine learning, neuro-linguistic programming, biometrics, blockchain, of course, any other decentralized ledgers, anything to do with augmented reality. So all of these are technologies being used in finance today. And I think an overview of all of this would be useful as well. But I think that's the future. I think there's a lot of training we need to do to fill that gap.
Sure. Now, one question specifically on wholesale lending, asked by Sagar Mukhani. The question is, how is fintech going to disrupt wholesale lending, and what kind of upskilling is required by a wholesale lending professional? And again, this question can be considered with respect to the skill building aspect, and maybe you can extend it to some of the other elements that you have touched upon in your presentation as well.
Yeah, I think it's a good question because fintechs are traditionally not seen as being very good at wholesale lending. I mean, the large institutions have such a monopoly over this market. So the way I see this capability developing is through collaboration. So if you look at the example of Canadian bank, Scotia Bank, who has partnered with a lending company called Cabbage, which is now acquiring bigger fintech. So they're pretty big now. And also you look at examples of Santander Bank, who have partnered with blockchain companies for providing corporate lending on that platform. There are two major completely different things here. One, you partner with fintechs in order to launch a completely new product. which looks really nice. The customer front end is absolutely brilliant, but the actual lending is done by the bank at the background. And the second kind of model of partnership is where you get the technology, which is decentralized, which is blockchain, and contracts are done automatically on that. But the disbursement of the actual products is done by the bank or the traditional company. So either of these two models work, but ultimately it's all about collaboration and partnership. Now, the skill you need to be in that disruptive wholesale and corporate lending process is to, of course, understand how the traditional firms do this process, where the cost savings can be obtained by bringing in technology. So a blockchain is one of the most popular tools to bring in cost savings on the wholesale lending side. So that's where I think you're going to find. So that skill, that knowledge of how can we use blockchain to disrupt this, I think that's going to be very useful.
Sure. And another question which has come from Praveen Bhagwan. The question is, what would be the role of FinTech in corporate finance? Again, there are applications of data analysis and big data analysis. But just to look at this question in a little broader context, if we look at that area of finance and the transaction advisory and the transactions which happen for corporates as well as for advisors, are there any avenues to look for to incorporate FinTech in those traditional roles?
Yeah, I mean, it's actually one of those roles and areas where you haven't seen much FinTech disruption yet. But I think you're absolutely right, Manda. I think data is where we're going to see that disruption happening in terms of one is bringing in all the data available within that organization in one place. So that itself is a huge challenge. So if you look at in a typical large organization here in the UK, they probably have around 200 legacy systems that hold data for corporate finance. So bringing all of that data together in one place, merging it together, making sure it's accessible, that itself is a large-scale digital transformation project. Now, once all the data is brought in, then you have the next set of disruption, which is using that data to make better decisions, making this data available through a nice-looking front end to people within the organization. And then the next step is to make it available to external people. So it could be investors, or it could be B2B2C consumers, or whoever needs access to some of the data. So I think all of that will probably happen. Now, the CEO of Barclays said a very interesting thing, which I think is relevant here, which is we all use, as consumers or as people, we use Google, we use Uber, we use Airbnb, all of these nice looking websites. The moment you step into the corporate finance world, all of the front end that you see on the computer is clunky and old and traditional. So the CEO of Barclays asked that question. I mean, why am I as a human being stepping from the world of Google to stepping into this world, where none of the data makes sense and it's presented so poorly? So that front end needs to change at some point and become like Google and become like Uber. And I think that front end transformation will happen in the next few years as well.
Sure, then that's helpful. Now, next question is, again, comparing and contrasting FinTech and traditional finance industries, more from a resilience point of view. We've been seeing economic crisis, we've been seeing other types of crises. How do you see FinTech as an industry? Again, from a bearing of the careers that we are discussing about. And it can be argued that FinTech got the fillip from 2008 economic crisis that we saw. So going forward, how do you see the resilience of industry vis-a-vis the traditional finance industry?
And that's a very good question, because you don't want to find a job in a dying industry, right? No, but I think every industry has ups and downs, and there will be a period of growth for FinTech, which we have seen over the last 10 years. And maybe in the next 5 years, we will see a trough as well. But my view is that we're going to see an economic crisis, not like 2008 with the collapse of Lehman Brothers and other big companies, but we're going to see an economic crisis which is much more subtle, but lasting for the next 10 years. So all of the profitability of banks, the revenues, the travel industry, the hospitality industry, all of this will suffer for the next 10 years. So we will see an economic crisis, recession, a mild recession for a long period of time rather than a collapse. Now, we need to look at FinTech from that view, in that almost the entire world is going into a recession. And I think technology becomes extremely important as a driver in the time of a recession. That's because you can actually obtain a lot of cost savings using technology, either to extract data or to reduce the cost of operations and the cost of serving customers. So in a time of economic crisis, I think FinTech is absolutely going to survive, and the real potential of technology will come into the front. Everybody will ask for value. I think you can't just say FinTech, blockchain, and get funding. I think there will be a focus on what is the value that you're delivering, rather than just say, oh, I'm a FinTech company, I need $1 million. And that's not going to happen anymore. It happens in India a lot, which I worry about, because any startup now says blockchain on their presentation and they get $1 million. But I think that shift will happen now, where the investors will say, what is the true value you're going to generate? What is the cost savings you're going to create? And then once that happens, FinTech will survive for a very long period before the next big trough. The funding numbers have gone down in the last 6 months, but I think that's a good sign in a way. Like I said, we want to focus on value creation rather than just funds being thrown at firms. So I'm not too worried about that. I've seen Challenger Bank downloads reducing a lot during the lockdown in the last 6 months, but it's slowly picking back up. Starling Bank have their numbers which have gone back to 2019 levels, so they have picked up in terms of app downloads. So it's coming back to 2019 levels slowly, and I think it will be another 10 years, at least 7 to 8 years before we see a big crash. For whatever reason, we can't predict in FinTech. Yeah.
Sure. So I think we are a little over time. There are many other questions, but maybe we'll take one more question and then call it a wrap. One question which has come, and I'm combining a couple of questions for the advantage of audience. One question was about the data structure, whether that is one skill, or data management is one skill that is required to enter into FinTech. Also, another element was any focus on, you mentioned that there's no need to learn programming per se, but if somebody has to start, what are the areas that they can look at to at least initiate the exploration?
Yeah, I don't think you need to learn data management necessarily, but I think data management comes into the picture in almost everything we talk about. So we spoke about risk, corporate finance, advisory, investment management, asset management. We talk about regulatory reporting, compliance, tax. So all of these segments, when you look at it, they all have an element of data under it. So if you are a CFA candidate and you're looking at a finance-based segment to get into, I think data is very important. So I would definitely start with data management, databases, using data through AI and ML as ways of starting out in FinTech. And of course, any other exposure to RegTech, any specific exposure to cybersecurity, things like that. You can specialize in something like that. But I think data is fundamental to everything we're talking about.
Sure. We have a few more questions, but unfortunately, we are headed towards the closure of the session. Time is never enough, which is the case here as well. So thank you so much, Devie, for sharing your perspectives. We really appreciate your time and perspectives. The discussion was very insightful, and I'm sure many, I'm one of them, would leave the session with a lot more insights and with inspiration. So thank you very much.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's a pleasure. And to the audience, thank you very much for attending the conference. We'll appreciate a lot if you can please share your feedback on the session. Thank you so much. Megha, over to you.
Thank you,